Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're watching this, you probably love geography, or at least want to correct some of the things your teachers told you in school. Let's be real, geography class was full of maps, capitals, and confusing facts that we just accepted as true. But guess what? A lot of what we learned was actually wrong. 1. The Panama Canal runs north to south. Let's talk about one of the most famous shortcuts in the world. The Panama Canal. This engineering marvel lets ships cut through Central America instead of making the ridiculously long journey around South America. Sounds simple, right? Well, here's the problem. Most people think the canal runs from north to south. In reality, the Panama Canal actually runs east to west. That's right, the way we visualize the canal is totally misleading. The reason for this is that Panama itself isn't shaped the way most people think it is. If you look at a standard world map, it makes it seem like Panama is a straight, vertical landmass, but in reality, it curves like a backward S. Because of this weird shape, when a ship moves from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, it's not traveling straight north like you might assume. Instead, it's actually moving in a northeast direction. If you ever visit the canal, it can really mess with your sense of direction because the sun rises and sets in places that don't match what you expect. So if you ever find yourself in a debate about which way the Panama Canal runs, now you know the truth. 2. Finland is part of Scandinavia. Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark all seem to get lumped together as Scandinavian countries, but that's actually not correct. This is one of those things that people just assume is true because Finland is right next to Sweden and Norway, and they all seem to have similar cold weather, forests, and, let's be honest, confusing languages. But technically, Finland is not part of Scandinavia. Scandinavia refers specifically to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The reason Finland gets included so often is that it's culturally and geographically close to these countries, but there's an actual term for the larger region that includes Finland: the Nordic countries. The Nordic region consists of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. One big reason Finland is different from its Scandinavian neighbors is language. Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish all come from the same Germanic language family, so they share a lot of similarities. Finnish, on the other hand, is from a completely different language group called Uralic, which makes it way more related to languages like Estonian and Hungarian than to Swedish or Norwegian. 3. North Korea and Finland are nowhere near each other. If you had to name two countries that seem completely unrelated to each other, North Korea and Finland would probably be on that list. One is a tiny Nordic country with saunas and reindeer, and the other is one of the most isolated nations in the world, locked in a Cold War time capsule. But here's something that might blow your mind. North Korea and Finland are actually separated by just one country. That country is Russia. If you travel in a straight line from Finland, cross through Russia, and keep going east, you'll eventually end up in North Korea. No ocean crossings, no crazy detours, just one single country in between. It's one of those facts that really messes with your sense of geography. Russia is so massive that it connects two places that seem like they should be worlds apart. So technically, if Finland and North Korea ever wanted to be neighbors, they'd only need Russia to move out of the way. 4. New Zealand is the closest country to Australia. When you picture Australia on a map, New Zealand always seems like the closest country. They're often grouped together in conversations about travel, culture, and accents. And since New Zealand is an island nation that doesn't share a land border with anyone, most people assume its closest neighbor has to be Australia. But surprisingly, the closest country to Australia isn't New Zealand, it's Papua New Guinea. At their closest points, Papua New Guinea and Australia are only about 150 kilometers apart. That's roughly the same distance as driving from one side of a major city to another. In contrast, the shortest distance between Australia and New Zealand is almost 2,000 kilometers. That's a pretty massive difference. The reason this misconception exists is that people don't really think about Papua New Guinea as much as they think about New Zealand. New Zealand is way more well-known internationally, especially in pop culture, so it overshadows its much closer neighbor. But if you look at a map, you'll see that Papua New Guinea is right there, practically a stone's throw away from northern Australia. 5. The large St. Mediterranean city is in Europe. When people think of the Mediterranean, they usually picture places like Italy, Spain, and Greece. It's one of the most famous regions in the world, full of ancient history, stunning coastlines, and, let's be honest, really good food. So it makes sense that people assume the largest city on the Mediterranean must be somewhere in Europe. Maybe Rome? Maybe Barcelona? Nope. The largest city on the Mediterranean isn't in Europe at all. It's Alexandria, Egypt. With a population of over 5 million people, Alexandria is bigger than any Mediterranean city in Spain, Italy, or France. It's an ancient city founded by Alexander the Great himself and has been one of the most important ports in the Mediterranean for thousands of years. One reason why people don't immediately think of Alexandria is that when they hear Mediterranean, they mostly think of the northern side of the sea. But the Mediterranean isn't just a European thing, it also borders North Africa and parts of the Middle East. And on the African side, Alexandria is the king. 6. All cold places are near the poles. When you think of freezing, icy landscapes, your mind probably goes straight to the Arctic or Antarctica. That makes sense because those are the coldest regions on Earth. But what if I told you there are some places nowhere near the poles that are also bitterly cold? Take the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, for example. These islands stretch across the northern Pacific Ocean, forming an arc that extends toward Russia. You'd think that since they're in the Pacific, they'd have a mild, oceanic climate. But that's not the case. The Aleutian Islands are icy, stormy, and some of the most brutally cold places in the world. These islands are part of Alaska, which most people associate with snow and freezing temperatures, but their location in the Pacific makes them an odd case. Despite being in a region known for warm ocean waters, the Aleutians are affected by powerful Arctic winds and cold ocean currents that make them feel much closer to the North Pole than they really are. So while most cold places are near the poles, don't assume that's the only place you'll find freezing conditions. Some of the coldest, windiest, and iciest regions on Earth exist in spots you wouldn't expect. 7. The Sahara Desert is the driest non-polar desert. The Sahara Desert is often described as the hottest and driest place on Earth, and while it's definitely scorching, it's actually not the driest desert. That title belongs to the Atacama Desert in Chile. The Atacama Desert is so dry that some parts of it haven't seen rain in centuries. Scientists believe that certain regions of the Atacama may not have had any significant rainfall for thousands of years. In contrast, the Sahara, while extremely dry, does get occasional rainfall and even experiences flash floods in certain areas. One of the biggest reasons for this misconception is that people tend to associate deserts with sand and heat, but deserts are actually defined by low precipitation, not temperature. That's why Antarctica is considered the largest desert in the world. It hardly gets any precipitation, even though it's covered in ice. So while the Sahara is an absolute furnace, it's not actually the driest place on Earth. 8. The US dollar is the strongest currency in the world. If you ask most people what the most powerful currency in the world is, they'll probably say the US dollar. And it makes sense. After all, the dollar is used in global trade, it's the world's reserve currency, and it's accepted in multiple countries outside the US. But the US dollar isn't actually the strongest currency in terms of value, it is Kuwaiti dinar instead. The Kuwaiti dinar has the highest exchange rate of any currency in the world. One Kuwaiti dinar is worth more than $3, which means if you ever exchange your money for Kuwaiti currency, you'll feel like you just lost half your wallet's worth. This happens because Kuwait, a small but wealthy country, has a massive oil industry that keeps its currency extremely valuable. Other strong currencies include the Bahraini dinar and the Omani rial, both of which are worth more than the US dollar. Now, does this mean the US dollar is weak? Not at all. The US dollar is still the most widely used currency in the world, but when it comes to pure value, it's not at the top. 9. Mexico and Central America are part of South America. It's easy to assume that Mexico and the countries of Central America belong to South America. After all, they share similar cultures, speak mostly Spanish, and are located just above South America. But in reality, Mexico and Central America are actually part of North America. Geographically, North America includes Canada, the United States, Mexico, and all the countries of Central America. South America doesn't actually begin until you reach Colombia. This might feel strange because culturally Mexico and Central America feel closer to South America than to places like Canada or the US. But geography doesn't always align with culture. A lot of this confusion comes from the fact that people group Spanish-speaking countries together as Latin America, which includes Mexico, Central America, and South America. But Latin America is a cultural and linguistic region, not a geographical one. So while Mexico has a lot in common with South American countries, it's firmly part of North America. 10. Portugal is a Mediterranean country. When you think of Mediterranean countries, Portugal seems like an obvious choice. It's got warm weather, stunning coastlines, incredible seafood, and that classic Southern European vibe. Plus, it's right next to Spain, which is a Mediterranean country. So, Portugal has to be part of the Mediterranean too, right? Not exactly. Portugal isn't a Mediterranean country at all. It borders the Atlantic Ocean, not the Mediterranean Sea. The reason this myth is so common is that Portugal shares a lot of cultural similarities with Mediterranean countries. It has the same kind of architecture, climate, and even cuisine as Spain, Italy, and Greece. But from a purely geographical standpoint, Portugal is 100% an Atlantic country. Now, Spain does have a Mediterranean coastline, but Portugal is completely cut off from the Mediterranean. If you want to get technical, Portugal is actually part of a region known as the Iberian Peninsula, which includes both Spain and Portugal. So, while Portugal might feel Mediterranean in spirit, it's geographically an Atlantic nation. 11th. Venice has the most canals in the world. Venice is known as the City of Canals. It's one of the most famous tourist destinations on the planet, and its iconic waterways make it feel like no other place in the world. With its winding canals, gondolas, and charming bridges, it's easy to assume that Venice has more canals than any other city. But guess what? It doesn't. In fact, there are at least two cities that have more canals than Venice: Amsterdam and Birmingham. Birmingham, England, has more canals than Venice. Most people don't associate Birmingham with canals, but it actually has over 160 kilometers of waterways, compared to Venice's about 150 kilometers. Amsterdam, another city famous for its canals, also beats Venice in total length of waterways. 12th. Florida has the southernmost point in the US. If you've ever been to Key West, Florida, you might have seen the famous southernmost point buoy, a colorful concrete marker that tells visitors they're at the southernmost point of the continental United States. Now, notice that sneaky little detail: continental United States. Because if we're talking about the entire United States, the southernmost point isn't in Florida at all. It's actually in Hawaii. Hawaii's Big Island has a place called Ka'la'i, also known as South Point, which is the true southernmost point of the United States. It's even farther south than Key West, yet it doesn't get nearly as much attention. This mix-up happens because most people think of the mainland US when they picture the country, but Hawaii changes the game when it comes to geography. If we're talking about all 50 states, Hawaii is the winner for both the southernmost and westernmost points in the country. So if you ever hear someone say Florida is the southernmost part of the US, just remind them about Hawaii and watch their reaction when they realize they've been wrong this whole time. 13. South America is east of Mexico. Most people think of South America as being directly south of North America. It makes sense, right? It's literally called South America, so it should be right below the United States and Mexico. But if you look at a map closely, you'll notice something surprising. Mexico is actually farther west than much of South America. When you look at a flat, Mercator projection map, the kind most of us saw in school, it makes it seem like North and South America are perfectly aligned from top to bottom. But that's not how geography actually works. Because of how the continents curve, large parts of South America are actually to the east of Mexico. In fact, if you draw a straight vertical line down from Mexico City, you'll find that most of Brazil, Argentina, and even parts of Chile are to the east of that line. A great way to prove this is by comparing time zones. For example, if you're in Cancun, Mexico, you're in the same time zone as New York City. But if you're in Sao Paulo, Brazil, you're already 1 or 2 hours ahead of New York, meaning Brazil is much farther east than you probably thought. This is just another example of how maps can distort the way we think about geography. Next time you picture the Americas, don't just assume everything lines up in a straight north to south direction. South America actually sits quite a bit to the east. 14. The UK is completely in the Western Hemisphere. When people think of the United Kingdom, they usually imagine it as part of Western Europe. And while that's true, there's a small detail that often gets overlooked. The UK isn't entirely in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, some parts of it actually cross into the Eastern Hemisphere. The reason for this is the prime meridian, the imaginary line that divides the Eastern and Western Hemispheres. This line runs right through Greenwich, a district in London, meaning that parts of London and southeastern England technically sit in the Eastern Hemisphere. It might not be a huge portion of the country, but it's enough to make the UK one of the few nations that straddle both hemispheres. It doesn't stop there. The Shetland Islands, located far north of Scotland, also stretch into the Eastern Hemisphere. This means that despite being considered a Western nation, parts of the UK actually lie in the East. This fun little geography fact doesn't change much in day-to-day life, but it's another great example of how borders and hemispheres don't always line up the way we assume they do. If you ever visit Greenwich, you can actually stand with one foot in each hemisphere, making it one of the easiest ways to travel between the Eastern and Western hemispheres without even leaving London. 15. The tallest mountain in Europe is Mont Blanc. Mont Blanc is famous for being the tallest mountain in Western Europe. Towering over the French and Italian Alps at an impressive 4,809 meters, it's often thought of as the highest peak in all of Europe. But while Mont Blanc is a massive and well-known mountain, it's not actually the tallest on the continent. It's Mount Elbrus that is located in Russia's Caucasus Mountains. Standing at a staggering 5,642 meters, Elbrus is not just taller than Mont Blanc, it's significantly taller. The reason for this confusion comes down to how people define Europe's borders. The Caucasus Mountains, where Mount Elbrus is located, sit on the border between Europe and Asia. Some people argue that the Caucasus belongs to Asia, which would disqualify Elbrus from being counted as Europe's tallest mountain. However, most geographers agree that the European continent extends to the Caucasus Mountains, making Elbrus the official tallest peak in Europe. That wraps up another round of geography myths busted. We still have more myths to cover, so stay tuned for the next part, where we'll dive into even more misconceptions. Let me know in the comments which of these surprised you the most. And if you're enjoying this series, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks Mont Blanc is the tallest mountain in Europe. See you in the next one.